Hey everybody, welcome back to another exciting edition of Question and Answer with Dr. Bowers. I'm glad you're here, and I really appreciate you guys sending in all these wonderful questions, so let's get right to it. First one we're going to tackle today is this question of externalized versus internalized pathological demand avoidance. And what we're talking about there is externalized is typically what we can see, what we can observe. And that includes, in the cases of PDA, we tend to see a lot more aggressive, acting out types of behaviors, yelling, screaming, refusal, maybe some destruction, maybe it's controlled destruction. Which is what I call it when, the child doesn't really want to destroy things, but they want to create a little chaos. And so they might strategically knock over chairs, but not in a way that's designed to necessarily break them. Or if it's an all-out rage episode, then of course, the upstairs brain, as we call it, might be turned off, might be flooded. We might be in the basement of the brain, which means that we're just kind of doing more primitive, aggressive, primal types of acting out. We tend to hear less language during that time, and we see more aggressive acting out types of behaviors. We do tend to see more externalized behaviors in younger children, also those who are less able to mask, as well as older children who may not have had much intervention. And sometimes, too, older children who have been in a low or no demand situation for too long can start to experience a bit of a rebound effect. That's a completely different topic for a different time, but it is something that we want to be mindful of and aware of to be able to know when to recognize that and how to avoid that, ideally, but if we get ourselves into it, how to get out of it. Externalized PDA and really externalized anything in sort of the psychiatric, psychological, mental health world is going to draw more attention from pediatricians, schools, clinicians, even society in terms of things that we're going to need to address. Now, if we shift over to the internalized form, we're looking at things that aren't always as observable, but oftentimes they are. So things like shutting down, mutism, which is a kind of a form of shutting down speech around certain types of people, withdrawing from situations, avoiding situations, somatic complaints too, tummy aches, headaches, basic internal stress reactions, maybe changes in appetite, maybe changes in toileting routines. Oftentimes too, these internalized things can be driven by or sometimes mistaken for anxiety or depression. Obviously, in the PDA space, we're going to see a tremendous amount of anxiety because that's really the sort of core issue here that drives a lot of this, whether it's internal or external. Anxiety is typically at the root of a lot of that. It's more common in girls to see more of the internalized or children who are just sort of socialized to please others. So we want to be aware that, and you can have a hybrid approach too. You're not necessarily just looking for one or the other. Sometimes you get a nice combination of both. So understanding both of these types is really important because it defines how we're going to then support this individual. And because the internalized PDA tends to go unnoticed, sometimes it can take us longer to recognize it. It can take us longer to get other people to believe us or to help us with that. So we want to be really aware of that. We also tend to see sometimes some gender differences in terms of how these presentations play out. But typically in PDA, regardless of male or female, it's a pretty much equal chance that you could see externalized versus something like if it's just, regular anxiety oftentimes, or even like attention deficit disorder. In girls, for example, is going to be more internal, like, daydreaming. And in boys, it tends to be more external, which is more acting out, fidgeting, restless behavior, hyperactivity, impulse control. So hopefully that's a pretty good description of our externalized versus internalized PDA. The next question kind of dovetails off of that, which is the distinctions between oppositional defiant disorder, or ODD, and pathological demand avoidance, or PDA. And in ODD, we tend to see that the defiance that occurs is deliberate. It is often strategic too. And the angry outbursts that we see along with ODD are not tied to any specific anxiety usually. It's more likely to escalate when that individual is confronted, when they have some sort of limit or restriction put on them, or there's some sort of punishment or consequence attempting to be delivered. And we'll see that sort of acting out cycle begin to occur there. Versus the case of PDA, we tend to see more avoidance being anxiety driven, not deliberate defiance. Oftentimes, a good example of that to sort of demonstrate that difference is if you ask someone with ODD to go to Disneyland and or Disney World and it's their favorite place to go, they're going to be just fine and go along with that. Somebody with PDA, though, even though could be their happiest place on earth, it's still a demand, and so we have to understand that it creates anxiety, and when that anxiety comes out, we start to see that defiance. We start to see the sort of PDA cycle begin to play out, whether it's that internalized or externalized or hybrid expression of that. Also in PDA, those kids or individuals are going to use more charm, they're going to use distraction, they're going to use negotiation, and they're going to use fantasy or role play to try to escape demands. And the role play can be acting like an animal, growling at you, pretending to be invisible, pretending to be a superhero or a different character in order to try to avoid being oneself and having to feel that stress and anxiety that tends to come with that. And the outbursts in PDA are going to follow attempts to comply when the individual is under some internal stress. And again, that internal stress is more anxiety driven versus ODD is more authority driven. You can't tell me what to do. You're not my boss. I don't have to respect you. I don't have to listen to you. So why does it matter in these cases to understand these distinctions? It's because traditional behavior management often makes PDA worse. And this is why things like ABA therapy, which is a wonderful intervention for many, many, many children, it gets a bad rap in the PDA world because there's a lot of clinician-driven, adult-driven demands that are put on the individual. And so that can worsen behavior in a case of PDA. Similar to trying to use like sticker charts, rewards, consequences like timeout, those just do not apply and do not work and actually are kind of like throwing gasoline onto a flame when you use those, just because when we're in those situations, right, when the traditional behavior management worsens things, it's because that individual doesn't want to comply because of anxiety, right? And so if we're putting them in timeout when they're anxious, we're not meeting that core need of theirs. And so because they aren't getting that core need met, they have to escalate even further and they can't self-soothe. They need that co-regulation often, and a timeout is a separation from a co-regulator. And so that can be kind of a bad thing to do. I hate to say it, but timeouts just really are not effective. In general, I mean, timeouts are kind of out of style anyway for most kids, but especially for kids with this PDA profile because the anxiety needs to be addressed. And so when they're in timeout, they can't, and they panic even more, and it's downright frightening for them. And so we have to be really, really careful about that. And that's why some of those old school parenting methods of I'll show you and I'm the boss and you listen to me kind of stuff, it just, good luck. It's not going to get you anywhere, and it's going to actually make your life a lot more complicated. PDA friendly strategies rely on connection with the child, collaboration, so trying to kind of get their buy-in and negotiate some things in advance before laying down, various demands or structures or routines, as well as trying to appeal to the child's autonomy to give them a sense of a little bit of freedom and free will. So if you're unsure, you should always seek professional guidance and advice with someone ideally with expertise in neurodivergent profiles when we're in these cases, especially even though there's not many of us, but those who are trained or competent in PDA-specific assessment, because it's just so important to be able to differentiate between all of these other possibilities. Disruptive mood dysregulation disorder, DMDD, might also be another distinction. It wasn't asked about in this question, so we're going to move on to something else, but that might be a nice topic for a future posting as well. Okay, so how do you know the difference between normal anxiety versus anxiety disorder. And, normal is a word that I don't use very often just because I don't really know what it means. I've always been told it's a city in Illinois, or it's a setting on a washer and dryer, but that's about it. So normal in terms of, what's expected. I mean, yes, we do look at things that are normative in terms of, does the majority of a standardization sample, in statistical analysis, you see that sort of bell curve, and things that kind of fall right in the center into the medius part of the curve where it arcs up. That tends to be more in the realm of expected behavior, typical behavior. And so anxiety being the sort of universal human condition, we need anxiety to survive. We need it to be able to motivate us, but also to protect us. But a lot of us get false alarm bells in our brains. It's like the smoke detector goes off, but there's no smoke or fire. It's an errant kind of alert. And our sympathetic nervous system is kind of the smoke detector. And oftentimes, even though, we live in a modern society where we get to sleep within four walls with locks on our doors and alarms and other things like that secure us. We don't have to sleep out in the woods and take shifts, night watch, sitting up to watch what's going on around us or listen for, twigs breaking because something is approaching us. We kind of sometimes in an anxious system, we don't realize that we're safe because our body's telling us that we're in danger, even though there may not be any stimulus that is threatening us. And so in normal anxiety, we tend to see that, these are individuals who it's proportionate to the situation, right? So I'm anxious because I have a big exam tomorrow and I want to do well. And when I'm working with kids in my clinic, I talk to them about the continuum of anxiety. So there's helpful anxiety on one end, and then there's everything in between, all the way out to harmful anxiety. And we want to keep ourselves obviously in the helpful range because when we do, it motivates us, it keeps us alert to our surroundings and aware, but not in a paranoid way. We just need to be alert and aware, and it keeps us driven to do things. If we didn't have helpful anxiety, then we wouldn't prepare for big events. We would just, go along with it, go with the flow, and show up and hope for the best. But the helpful anxiety really does inspire and motivate us. But when we get into the harmful anxiety, we're going to see anxiety or fear that is disproportionate to the situation. So we might be panicking and having panic attacks, even though, everyone around us might be having a good time. And the anxiety is not gonna come and go. It's gonna be persistent. So in normal anxiety, like for an exam, say, or you got a big date tomorrow, you got a big event, or you've got something else that you're really, maybe a big dance or something that you're looking forward to, that's going to be more of a temporary thing. And once you get to the event, usually then that settles down. Or if say you're afraid of flying, and you get anxious, more and more anxious as it gets closer, but if you can get on that plane and get to the destination, then you immediately feel better and you're able to overcome the anxiety. But in a case of anxiety disorder, it's going to be persistent. It's going to last months, weeks. The medical world uses a nice rule of thumb, which is like, say you hurt your ankle and you can walk on it, but it feels a little sore, a little tender. Most providers are going to say, okay, let's keep an eye on it for a week or two. And if it doesn't improve with, rest and elevation and heat or cold and some ibuprofen or Motrin, then we're going to want to check you out, maybe do an x-ray and, see if we need to kind of look into this further. And same thing with anxiety. It's going to be persistent if it's more of an anxiety disorder that's starting to develop. And then ultimately, with any diagnosis that we're going to make in the psychological world, at least, we're going to need to see that it impairs functioning in at least two areas. And so we can see school refusal, we can see sleep disruptions like insomnia, we can see avoidance of social gatherings or fun outings, we can see chronic somatic complaints like stomach aches or headaches that really develop. And when we see that at home and, in a child's life, it would be at school, or it would be socially with friends or in clubs or groups, or it might be even we see it, if your child is homeschooled but they go to church, we might see it at home and then at church, or when we're trying to leave, even to run errands, sometimes you can see anxiety brewing. So that's where we're looking for those differences. So again, a child who worries about an upcoming test and maybe loses a little sleep that night, or they have a big race tomorrow they want to do well in, that's going to be normal anxiety. A child who cries daily for weeks and won't enter the school building, and every Sunday night it's just a nightmare during the school week of I have to go back and I can't sleep and it's coming out of the room every night multiple times, then we're starting to kind of get into more of the anxiety disorder realm. So hopefully that is helpful. All right, on to the next one, learning disability diagnosis. Great question. What we look for there is a process. So usually there's an initial concern raised by, it could be you, just in your everyday interactions with your child. It could be a teacher, it could be a relative, it could be the pediatrician, but somebody's going to bring up that they're concerned about the child's learning profile. And I beg you, if you're a parent and your child attends school and you have a teacher who brings concerns to you about a child's learning profile, this is not the time to let your ego get in the way. This is not the time to fight back and prove that everyone else is wrong and that you know your child the best. Because just looking into this, okay, worst case scenario, we look into it and there's nothing, which is actually probably the best case scenario, right? So we spend a little time and we invest a little bit of financial energy into getting that checked out, and we realize everything's okay. Okay, then we can move on. But if a teacher who has, specializes in, there are teachers out there who only teach one grade. They specialize in that stage and age of development for their entire careers. And so if you're talking about, say, a third grade or a fourth grade teacher who's asking you to kind of come in and meet and talk about your child's learning profile, you better pay attention. You better listen, because you're going to be missing, especially at that age, you're going to be missing a tremendous opportunity to change the course of their entire life if you can get on top of this now. But if you want to push back and get mad at the teacher, then you've made your bed and you're going to lie in it. If this child does have a learning concern, now we're going to waste time, and we're going to keep pushing and hoping, and we're going to start to create new issues for this child. Because if their underlying learning profile is not being addressed properly, new things are going to start to develop. Social stress, anxiety, fear, sadness, stomach aches, headaches. There's all kinds of different symptoms that are going to show up. Avoidance types of behaviors. The child wants to skip out on certain classes or use the bathroom during times that they aren't able to kind of keep up. And before long, young kids will ask each other about their struggles or notice if a child's not able to keep up, and then the child begins to shut down on those types of inquiries too. So let's get ahead of it. If that initial concern is raised, let's think about a referral for an evaluation. And that can include, if you're in a public school, your school can do that for you. They have school psychologists who are highly trained and able to do that assessment to really look at the child's cognitive profile and the child's academic profile. You can see a clinical psychologist who's trained in educational evaluations. You can see a neuropsychologist if you want to look into more than just the learning profile. There's a variety of different approaches and ways of doing it. Sometimes insurance covers it. Oftentimes they don't, though, because sadly a lot of our insurance companies still view educational assessment as an elective procedure, similar to how they would view like a plastic surgery procedure, as if the child's educational development isn't going to influence every other area of their levels of functioning in life. But that's an argument for another time. So if you do submit to a psychoeducational evaluation with your child, they're going to want to look at IQ or cognitive functioning, and that's just the baseline of learning. And so we want to see, as a clinician, what is this kid entering the classroom with under the hood, so to speak? What kind of engine are they operating with? Do they operate better verbally, non-verbally? How's their processing speed? How do they hold information online in order to make sense of it and to work with it? How's their fluid reasoning or learning on the fly, learning new and novel information? And what sort of things, get their brain excited and their brain is happy and comfortable with, and what things seem to be causing challenges. Then what we're going to do is look at the academic profile to see, okay, how does this child now read and write and do math? How do they apply this information when they've heard it? How do they reason with it, do reading comprehension? There's all kinds of variables, memory functioning that we look at. And what we're looking for a lot of times is that discrepancy. So if we do the cognitive assessment and everything looks intact, but then we start looking into math or writing or reading and we start to see that they sort of nosedive in one of those areas, then we're starting to say, okay, that is the nature of a learning disability. And I explain this to kids. If you're not intelligent, we're not going to call it a disability. We're just going to say, unfortunately, that you've got some cognitive delays, that you're cognitively impaired, that you may have an intellectual disability, which means that it's going to be tough to learn across the board. But if you have a learning disability, what we're telling the child is, we know you're intelligent, we know you're competent, we know you're capable. So it should not be this hard when we ask you to do some math work or when we ask you to read. You're not keeping up at the rate that we expect for your stage and age of development. And we're able to look at that data across what's called a stratified sample, which is a representative sample of children across, at least in our measures here, across the United States, to try to see how this particular child stacks up to other third graders in the spring semester of their third grade year, or whatever the case may be for the child's age and stage of development. And so if we see some big discrepancies between those things, then we're going to start to see, okay, there is a disability here. And we need that information to then be able to coordinate with the school and to sort of make the school, if you will, or inspire the school to really approach that child's learning from a different angle. They're not going to be able to just keep up and learn with the peer group in that particular topic. They're going to need some additional specialized intervention. And the sooner we can pounce on it, going back to the comment about when teachers bring this stuff up, listen to them. Take it seriously. This is not the time to get into a battle and to start arguing with the teacher. If they're bringing this to you, we need to get it checked out. And we can ask them to check it out if they have those resources, or we can check it out ourselves. But let's at least get that ruled out to make the point that we need to help this child, or we need to move on and quit talking about concerns about this child. So I hope that that's helpful as well. I got a little time here for one more, which is a good one, which asks about accommodations for attention deficit disorders. And these are things that help level the playing field. So if it doesn't mean that if you have a child that doesn't have ADHD and another child with ADHD is getting accommodations, we're not giving that ADHD child any advantage. We're actually just trying to level the playing field. Okay, it's about equity there. And actually, one of the college testing boards had to do this research back in the day when families started to request time extensions on standardized tests like the SAT and the ACT. Many other parents were up in arms, saying that this is unfair. We should not have students that get extra time. They have an advantage over my child who has to take the SAT or the ACT within the allotted period of time. And so the college testing board did their own research on this to see, okay, if we give somebody who doesn't need additional time that accommodation, what happens? Because these parents were arguing that those kids were getting an unfair advantage. Well, what actually ended up happening was that the kids who got extra time but didn't need it, they didn't have any disability that required additional time, they ended up performing more poorly on the SAT and ACT with that extra time. Why, you may ask, is because they had too much time to overthink. And many of them went back and second-guessed themselves and changed answers and didn't really manage their time properly. So it just goes to show, like, if you need accommodations, it levels the playing field. It is not advantageous. So in the case of ADHD, you can go online. I would recommend it. I mean, there's some great ADHD reputable websites that have just amazing lists of accommodations that you can ask for, whether it's a 504 plan here in the United States or an IEP. The IEP is the Individualized Education Program. Section 504 is anything that's going to be, it's usually a pretty brief 2-page document. It's going to be anything that's not going to cost your school district any money. Versus an IEP says, hey, my child is going to need to work with a school psychologist, a counselor, occupational therapist, a speech therapist, a reading resource room support teacher, a mathematics specialist, whatever the case might be. The school district has to employ those people, and those people have to allot a certain amount of time in their schedule for your child, and so that's where the IEP comes in. That's a lot more difficult to get. A lot more goes into that process, but you can have a list of accommodations, and yes, for an ADHD student, they can oftentimes have an IEP. Typically, the eligibility for that is under otherwise health impairment. And then you'll see a list of different accommodations. For the 504, though, freebie accommodations are things like preferential seating, so your child can sit up close to the front of the room by the teacher regardless of the seating chart. Or the child can have movement breaks to move freely throughout the day, maybe in a situation where otherwise the teacher expects everyone to stay seated, or maybe all the kids in the room can only have one bathroom break, per morning and one in the afternoon, and this child might need to kind of walk back and forth several times. Oftentimes a really fun accommodation for younger kids is the teacher will give the child an empty envelope and they'll ask them to courier it down to the front office, which gives them a nice movement break. It gives them a chance to kind of go down there and socialize a little bit with some of the front office staff. It helps them to maybe develop some relationships with people outside of the classroom too. You have to have some pretty clear-cut rules in place for that, because oftentimes those kids will want to peek in every classroom as they go down the hallway or touch all the fun artwork on the wall or that's on display. And so you really have to keep them focused on, keep both hands on that envelope, and keep your eye on the pathway to that front office so that you can get down there, deliver this, and then head on back. And that gives them a nice movement break. As kids get older, a lot of them like to have additional time on certain exams or a quiet, private place to test. Maybe they have a proctor in the room with them that reads, the directions to them, or they print the directions on the top of every page of the exam. So for students who struggle to kind of keep that instructional set online long enough and they start making careless mistakes because they don't remember the original instruction, those can be wonderful accommodations too. Fidget tools that are appropriate that aren't becoming a distraction can be used. Getting a copy of class notes as we get older, and having verbal re-instructions reinforced through visual cues or otherwise more elaborately explained by a teacher before the examination starts can be helpful. So that was a great list of questions for today. I really appreciate it. There's still a bunch in the hopper that I will be getting to in the coming weeks, and I strongly encourage everyone to be able to send their questions in through our website, drmarkbowers.org. It's been great spending this time with you today. I appreciate your time and attention, and I look forward to seeing you again real soon.